I despise him. That's what Steven Spielberg said. Not behind closed doors, not whispered to a trusted friend, but out loud, on record. And he was talking about Rob Reiner. The same Rob Reiner who brought us The Princess Bride, Stand By Me, When Harry Met Sally, a man hailed as Hollywood royalty. A director, an actor, a liberal icon. A man who seemed untouchable. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But then came the murder. A blood-soaked night at the Reiner estate. Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle found stabbed to death in their $13.5 million Brentwood mansion. The only suspect? Their son, Nick Reiner. And guess what was found clutched in Nick's trembling hands? A script. But not just any script. A screenplay that hadn't seen the light of day since 1983. A screenplay that Steven Spielberg had once shared, quietly, hesitantly, with a trusted friend. That friend was Rob Reiner. Now Spielberg says Reiner stole it, lied about it, turned it into a Hollywood hit, and never gave him credit. For decades, Spielberg stayed silent. While Reiner collected awards, accolades, and adoration, Spielberg buried his fury. He didn't confront, didn't accuse, didn't even whisper the betrayal out loud. Until now. And it all came crashing down the moment two bodies hit the floor. But why is this coming out now? Why did Spielberg wait so long to speak? Why did Nick Reiner, a Hollywood heir, a man born into privilege, erupt in an explosion of violence that stunned even the LAPD? And how does a lost script tie together one of the greatest betrayals in Hollywood history with a brutal double homicide? That's what we're going to uncover, piece by piece. But first, let me ask you something. What would you do if your closest friend stole your idea and turned it into a legacy you could never reclaim? Would you confront them? Would you sue? Or would you bury it and let your silence eat you alive? Spielberg chose silence for almost 40 years. But behind the scenes, that silence was boiling. And the story you're about to hear isn't just about a stolen idea. It's about ego, betrayal, generational trauma, and how one man's obsession with the truth ended in bloodshed. Let's rewind. The year was 1983. Spielberg was riding high off E.T. and Raiders of the Lost Ark. He was the golden child of New Hollywood, a wunderkind with the Midas touch. Rob Reiner, by contrast, was still best known for playing meathead on All in the Family. He hadn't yet directed a feature film. He was itching for a breakout, desperate to prove he wasn't just the son of Carl Reiner or a sitcom punchline. So when the two men crossed paths in Los Angeles, at a private screening, a charity event, a dinner party hosted by a mutual producer, accounts differ. They clicked. Shared sensibilities, a love for storytelling, a hunger to reshape the emotional core of the American screen. According to multiple sources, Spielberg mentioned a script he was developing, a heartfelt, emotionally raw tale about a father and son on a road trip through the supernatural. Not flashy, not big budget, but deeply personal. And Reiner was captivated. He asked questions, took notes, listened intently. Then, Spielberg shelved the idea. Other projects took over. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was coming. The color purple loomed on the horizon. Reiner? He got to work. And 2 years later, he directed Stand By Me, a coming-of-age tale. Quiet, intimate, nostalgic, poignant. Critics called it a masterpiece of emotional storytelling. Spielberg called it familiar, but he didn't say more. Not then. Flash forward to 1995. A strange phone call. Spielberg's longtime producer, Kathleen Kennedy, receives a voicemail from a former assistant of Reiner's. The voice on the other end is shaky, almost frantic. I think he took Steve's story, the voice says. He called it something else, but the structure, the emotion, it's all there. The tape was never released publicly, but it circulated quietly among Spielberg's closest allies. He refused to act on it. And yet, that voicemail would eventually resurface in the most unlikely place, a police evidence log. Because 31 years later, Nick Reiner would use it as part of his defense. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about Nick, the golden boy who lost his way, the son who lived in the shadow of a Hollywood legend and cracked under the weight. Nick was born into privilege, attended private schools, spent summers on set with A-list actors. But from an early age, he showed signs of discontent. Teachers called him withdrawn. Friends said he was moody. He struggled with substance abuse in his teens. By his early 20s, he'd gone through 3 stints in rehab and a failed screenwriting career. His scripts were often described as angry and revenge-driven. One of them, insiders say, was about a father who steals from his son. The twist? The son kills him. It was rejected by every major studio. But Nick's obsession with betrayal, especially betrayal within families, didn't stop there. In the final year of his parents' lives, he was living in the guest house of the Brentwood estate. Detached from the main house, rarely seen at dinners, often up at 3 a.m., pacing the driveway with earbuds in and a leather-bound journal under his arm. When the murders happened, police initially assumed robbery, until they found that journal. And the script. The script, recovered from Nick's room, matched the structure and dialogue of Spielberg's abandoned 1983 draft, almost word for word. So how did Nick get it? That's where the story takes a darker turn. According to court filings, Nick had broken into his father's office weeks before the murder. What he found stunned him. A folder labeled SS/original, do not use. A letter addressed to a studio head, never sent. Notes in the margins, in Spielberg's handwriting. Nick, who had struggled for years to earn his father's approval, suddenly saw everything differently. Not only had Rob stolen an idea, he'd built a legacy on it. In the days leading up to the killings, Nick's behavior changed dramatically. He stopped drinking. He withdrew large amounts of cash. He Googled, what happens if a parent admits to intellectual theft? And he made one final call, to someone in Spielberg's camp. We don't yet know what was said on that call, but it lasted 47 minutes. And according to records, Spielberg himself was on the line. The day after that call, Nick left a message on his father's phone. You lied to everyone. You lied to me. I'm going to set this right. Now, as Nick faces life in prison and the Reiner estate becomes the backdrop of a true crime circus, Spielberg has finally spoken. His words were simple, deadly, and irreversible. I despise him. He stole something from me and never gave it back. But this isn't just about ego, or jealousy, or even murder. It's about what happens when silence festers, when loyalty becomes liability, when a single idea, a single untold story, becomes the weight that drowns a family. And Spielberg? He's not done talking, because buried in the safe at the Reiner estate was an envelope marked, "For Steven, if anything happens to me." But what was inside that envelope? And why did Spielberg cry when he read it? What could possibly be more shocking than betrayal and murder? You're about to find out. Because what comes next changes everything. What was in that envelope? Why would Rob Reiner, a man who built a pristine career off wit and wisdom, leave behind a sealed note for the very person he betrayed, the man he wronged, ignored, and outshined for decades? More importantly, why now? To answer that, we have to go back. Back before the script, before the betrayal, back to when Spielberg and Reiner weren't enemies. They were allies, or so it seemed. It started with a handshake. Los Angeles, the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. A charity gala for the Motion Picture and Television Fund. Spielberg, fresh off Jaws, was already a phenomenon. A director who could make blockbusters feel intimate. Reiner? Still meathead from All in the Family. Still trapped in his father's comedic shadow. But he had ambitions. And that night, as the band played swing covers and Hollywood's elite clinked glasses, Steven Spielberg and Rob Reiner met. Not as legends, but as two men who wanted more. Steven was kind to him, one attendee later said. They talked about movies, pacing, story arcs. Rob was like a sponge. A friendship formed quickly. They bonded over their fathers, over early failures, over their obsession with capturing emotional truth on screen. It was the kind of bond that, from the outside, looked unbreakable. But here's the thing about Hollywood friendships. They're made of glass. Beautiful, fragile, and always one hairline fracture away from shattering. And that fracture? It started with a script. Fast forward to 1983. Spielberg was developing something different. Not a spectacle, not aliens or adventure, but something intimate. A father and son on a cross-country trip. But here's the twist. The son had powers. He could see moments from other people's lives by touching objects. They don't know what they're running from at first, only that the boy's visions are becoming more vivid and more dangerous. The emotional core? A grieving father trying to reconnect. A boy burdened by something he never asked for. Spielberg called it echoes. He didn't pitch it to studios. Didn't announce it in the trades. It was just a draft, quietly developing in his writing cabin in Big Bear. Only a few people knew. Reiner was one of them. So how did Reiner come into that circle of trust? Simple. He asked. He came over one night with Chinese takeout and a six-pack. Spielberg had just gotten back from a location scout for Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. The two men sat on the patio, looking out over Laurel Canyon. Spielberg mentioned he was playing with something quieter. A father-son tone poem, he called it. Reiner pressed. Spielberg caved. He read a few pages aloud. Reiner was hooked. He kept asking questions. What if the visions get stronger? What if the kid sees something from the dad's past? Spielberg laughed, assuming it was just friendly banter. What he didn't know? Reiner went home that night and made notes. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever shared something deeply personal with someone, only to realize later they were listening for the wrong reasons? It's the kind of betrayal that doesn't show up right away. It creeps in. Subtle. Silent. That's how it started for Spielberg. 2 years later, 1985. Reiner directs Stand By Me. It's a critical triumph. A surprise hit. The coming-of-age story America didn't know it needed. Spielberg sees it at a private screening. He's stunned, not by the quality, which was excellent, but by the tone, the rhythm, the emotional DNA. It was Echoes without the supernatural. The father-son angle had been swapped for childhood friendship. The visions? Gone. But the pacing, the structure, the conversations under train bridges and pine trees? Unmistakable. Spielberg doesn't say a word. He doesn't sue. Doesn't call Reiner. Doesn't even ask for credit. He goes home, and he locks Echoes away. Why didn't he confront him? Because Spielberg believed in grace. Because Reiner was finally making a name for himself. Because the industry, even then, was smaller than it seemed. Going after Rob would have made Spielberg look petty, one insider said. It was easier to just let it go. Or so he thought. But Spielberg did make one move. He stopped inviting Reiner to private screenings. He removed him from his Christmas card list. He distanced himself, quietly, but definitively. Reiner noticed. He told friend Spielberg was jealous, called him too commercial, and even joked during a Q&A that Spielberg didn't understand small stories. What he didn't know was that Spielberg had kept the original Echoes draft. Dated, annotated, registered, just in case. And now let's bring Nick into the picture. As a child, Nick adored Spielberg. He visited sets. Called him Uncle Steve. He once told a school friend, I want to be like Spielberg, but funnier. Then came the teenage years. The anger. The questions. He asked his dad why they weren't close to Spielberg anymore. Reiner reportedly said, Steve got weird about a script. Nick remembered that. And when he started struggling with his own creative voice, he came back to that line. Steve got weird about a script. But what if Steve wasn't weird? What if he was right? There's a story Nick's childhood friend told police. Said it happened in 2006. Nick had just returned from rehab. Was living at home. He found a locked cabinet in his dad's office. Pried it open with a letter opener. Inside, a manila folder. A screenplay. Title page, Echoes. Author, Steven Spielberg. Handwritten in red ink. SS/original, do not use. Nick asked his father about it. Reiner allegedly said, it was a gift. He never did anything with it. But even Nick, in his drug-addled haze, knew that wasn't true. And from that moment on, the respect he had for his father cracked. Years later, that crack would become a rupture. Nick tried to write his own scripts. They went nowhere. He accused his father of having built an empire off theft. They fought, yelled, went months without speaking. At one point, Nick left a note on his dad's bedroom door. Return what you took. You owe him. You owe me. Reiner never responded. But he didn't throw away the script either. He locked it back in the safe. So here we are. Two friends. One idea. A rising star who fell from grace. And a buried draft that refused to stay buried. But Spielberg's silence wasn't just about self-restraint. It was about strategy. Because what Reiner didn't know was that Spielberg had been keeping records. Voicemails. Journal entries. A voice memo from 1993. And a recording, made without Reiner's knowledge, of their infamous dinner in Santa Barbara. A dinner where Spielberg, after 3 glasses of wine, said, You really think I don't know what you did? Reiner laughed. Steve, it's just a story. Stories belong to the world. Spielberg's response, No, they belong to the people who live them. That recording will surface. But not yet. Because before it does, two bodies will fall. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever created something from your soul, and then watched someone else take credit for it? Imagine the feeling. You're sitting in a darkened theater. The audience laughs. They cry. They clap. They call it a masterpiece. And deep inside, you know every beat, every line, every tear, because you wrote it. But your name isn't in the credits. That's the agony Steven Spielberg lived with for over 30 years. And it all comes back to one missing draft. The blueprint for a story that would never carry his name, but shaped a Hollywood legacy built on lies. Let's rewind to 1983. Spielberg was in creative overdrive. He was juggling Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, setting the stage for The Color Purple, and trying to decide whether to helm a sci-fi thriller called Starman. He passed. It went to John Carpenter. But there was one project he was personally attached to. A quiet, slow-burn drama. No aliens. No action. Just a boy, a father, and a strange gift. The script was called Echoes. It was never meant to be a blockbuster. It was meant to be honest. The plot. Simple. A recently widowed father, emotionally distant and grieving, takes his 11-year-old son on a spontaneous road trip after the boy is expelled from school for disturbing behavior. The reason for the expulsion? The boy claims he can hear things when he touches old objects, snippets of conversations, flashes of memories, long-dead voices. The father doesn't believe him, thinks it's trauma, grief. But as they drive cross-country, encountering strangers, antiques, motels, haunted diners, the visions intensify. In one town, the boy touches a war medal and describes the death of a soldier in vivid detail. The father is shaken. By the third act, the father begins to believe. But what he doesn't know? The boy's visions are leading somewhere, to his mother's past, to a secret she never told, and the father's darkest fear. That she didn't die, she ran. Spielberg never intended to release Echoes in the mid-80s. The industry wasn't ready. Studios wanted popcorn hits, not spiritual dramas about grief and fatherhood. So Spielberg shelved it. Quietly. Only a few people ever saw the first draft. His then-girlfriend and future wife, Amy Irving, producer Frank Marshall, and, crucially, Rob Reiner. Now here's where the story gets murky. Spielberg stored his physical drafts in a locked, climate-controlled vault in his home office. Each script had a cover sheet with initials, a log number, and a handwritten title in Sharpie. But one day in 1985, Echoes was missing. At the time, he didn't panic. Spielberg had backups. But he did find it strange. That very same year, Reiner announced his next project. A story about 4 boys on a journey. A story that would become Stand By Me. Let's be clear. Stand By Me is based on Stephen King's novella The Body. That's not in dispute. But what is in dispute is how Reiner framed the emotional architecture. Spielberg, in private notes later shared during a closed-door deposition, wrote, "The rhythm is too similar. The beats, the pauses, the stretch of silence before emotional reveals. That was Echoes, not The Body." And when you rewatch Stand By Me through that lens, it's hard to ignore. There's the late-night confession scene, the isolated wanderer trope, the longing for a parent's approval, the spiritual melancholy of 2 characters walking toward memory instead of destiny. That was Echoes in spirit, even if not in script. In 1991, a former intern at Castle Rock, Reiner's production company, claimed to have seen a script in the office with the name Spielberg on the title page. When she asked about it, she was told, "That's an old draft. Never use. Legal reasons." That document, believed to be the original Echoes, vanished, until it was found in a guest house in Brentwood, with blood on it. But we'll come back to that. So how did Spielberg know it had been taken? Because in 1986, a curious thing happened. He received a royalty check from a story consultant, a man he'd paid to provide notes on Echoes. Except Spielberg never used the notes. And the consultant never expected payment. Why the check? Because the consultant's notes had been used in another project. The Sender, a shell company associated with Castle Rock. Spielberg called it a clerical mistake. But privately, he knew. He made a single entry in his journal that year. He took it. He knows I know. I won't be kind next time. There was no next time. Not yet. Now let's fast forward again, to 2025. Nick Reiner, estranged from his father and battling addiction, was living in the guest house. One night, in a manic episode, he tore through his father's office. He claims he was looking for proof. Proof that Rob Reiner had built his career on stolen foundations. What he found was a black binder labeled SS/original. Inside, a copy of Echoes, dated 1983. Spielberg's name on the top. Notes in red ink. Margins marked, use later, in Rob's handwriting. Nick snapped pictures. Printed copies. One of those copies ended up in the blood-soaked living room. Let's stop here and ask the real question. Why didn't Spielberg go public in the 80s? Or the 90s? Or even after Nick's discovery? Because betrayal in Hollywood doesn't always explode. Sometimes it erodes. Spielberg knew confronting Reiner would make him look vengeful. He was already a legend. What would he gain? A petty feud? A hit to his brand? So he did what he'd done for decades. He waited until someone else set fire to the truth. And here's the twist. That original Echoes script wasn't just a passion project. It was based on Spielberg's real life. Few people know this, but when Spielberg was 16, he discovered something shocking in his family history, a secret about his mother's past. Something involving an estranged relative, a silent affair, and a breakdown that split his family for years. He poured that pain into Echoes, used fiction to wrestle demons, told the story he never dared to say out loud, and Reiner turned it into his triumph. There's a moment in Stand By Me when Gordy tells the story of the pie-eating contest. It's funny, silly, but suddenly it shifts. You see Gordy's pain, his need to be seen, to be heard, to matter. Spielberg said once in an interview, that scene, that's the core of Echoes. That was mine. But he didn't fight. Until the blood. Until the folder. Until Nick. And here's where it gets chilling. That draft, the one found in the guest house, had a note attached. A torn page. Handwritten. With 6 words. He said it was a gift. Who wrote it? No one knows. But Nick Reiner underlined that line 3 times in red pen. The discovery of the draft changed everything. It turned speculation into evidence. Whispers into screams. Memory into murder. Spielberg, upon seeing the recovered copy, reportedly wept. He told his legal team, "That's the version I gave him. That's mine. That's me." And for the first time, he wasn't just angry. He was ready. But what came next, no one could have prepared for. Because that draft wasn't the only thing Nick found. There were tapes, letters, a confession. How far can you bend a story before it breaks? Before it stops being inspired by and starts being stolen? Before creative borrowing becomes an act of betrayal? And more importantly, who gets to decide? Hollywood has always thrived on blurred lines. Ideas are shared, reshaped, reimagined. A scene here, a tone there. Everyone borrows. Everyone lifts. Right? But sometimes it's not just a coincidence. Sometimes it's a surgical operation. Performed under the cover of admiration. That's what Spielberg believed Rob Reiner did to Echoes. He didn't steal a plot. He stole the soul of the script. And what followed was decades of silence, guilt, and performance, wrapped up in applause and awards. But the performance? It started with a pitch. Castle Rock, 1984. Rob Reiner walks into a boardroom. He's got a stack of notes, a beat sheet, a log line. He says he's been working on a new idea. A group of boys set out to find a dead body. But really, it's about confronting grief, masculinity, and the secrets adults hide from children. His partners love it. It's dark but nostalgic. It's King, but more grounded. And Reiner adds one more twist. It's about memory. How childhood echoes in us forever. That line, that word, echoes. It wasn't just metaphor. It was the original title of Spielberg's script. And someone in that room, according to an anonymous former Castle Rock employee, raised a red flag. They whispered, "Didn't Spielberg have something with that title?" Reiner allegedly waved it off. It's just a phrase. It's not the same project. But years later, that same employee testified under oath. Rob had the Echoes script in his desk drawer during that time. I saw it. Now let's be fair. Stand By Me is credited to Stephen King. It was based on The Body, a novella in King's 1982 collection Different Seasons. The plot is clearly King's. The bones, the arc, the characters, all his. But Spielberg never claimed Reiner stole the story. He claimed Reiner stole the structure, the emotional blueprint of echoes. And once you know that, you start to see the seams. Compare the two stories. Echoes, a child burdened by a supernatural gift. A road trip that begins with anger and ends in emotional revelation. A father-son journey through grief, silence, and eventual reconciliation. Climax involves confronting a family secret that changes everything. Stand By Me. A group of boys on a journey. Begins with schoolyard bravado, ends in emotional vulnerability. The lead character, Gordy, is processing the death of his brother. Final moment of transformation is Gordy confronting the fact his father doesn't love him the same. The pacing, the emotional rhythm, the subtext of parental disconnect. It's uncanny, and it wasn't just Spielberg who noticed. 1990, a panel at UCLA. Spielberg is asked about directing coming-of-age stories. He smiles, then says, "I once had a project about a boy who hears the past. We never made it. But when I saw Stand By Me, I thought, maybe someone did." The room laughs, but the smile doesn't reach his eyes. Privately, Spielberg was seething. In a journal entry from 1993, later published by a biographer, he wrote, "He reframed my pain into someone else's profit. I never said it out loud. Maybe I should have. But the applause was too loud." By then, Stand By Me was considered a classic. Reiner had gone on to direct The Princess Bride and A Few Good Men. He was no longer meathead. He was the guy who turned childhood pain into gold. And Spielberg? He stayed quiet. But in 1998, everything changed. Here comes the phone call. According to Spielberg's longtime assistant, he received a call from a private number. On the other end, Rob Reiner. They hadn't spoken in years. Reiner was working on a new project. He wanted Spielberg's input. "Just a lunch," he said. Spielberg agreed. They met at the Ivy, classic power lunch spot, full of photographers, producers, and studio heads. Over pasta and Pellegrino, Reiner floated an idea. What if we revisited Stand By Me from the father's perspective? Spielberg went still. He asked slowly, "Why now?" Reiner's answer, "Because there's more to the story. Always was." Spielberg didn't finish his lunch. He stood up, left a $100 bill on the table, and said, loud enough for two nearby diners to hear, "You already told my story once, Rob. You don't get to tell it again." And from that moment on, everything shifted. Spielberg stopped being silent. Privately, he told Amy Pascal, Kathleen Kennedy, Jeffrey Katzenberg. He didn't make a public accusation, but he made it clear within the industry. He didn't trust Rob Reiner. And slowly, their circles stopped overlapping. No more invites. No more panels. No more charity galas. Hollywood knew something had gone wrong. But nobody knew just how deep it ran. Then came the twist. In 2003, Spielberg's team received a strange package. No return address. Inside, a photocopy of Echoes. And a typed note. "This is the version he showed to the board in '84. Keep it safe." It was unsigned, but the watermark on the paper matched Castle Rock's old letterhead. Someone inside Reiner's camp was leaking. But why? To this day, that source remains unidentified. But that leak confirmed what Spielberg had long suspected. Reiner didn't just borrow the idea. He repurposed it, surgically. Here's how he did it. He took the supernatural angle and removed it. Replaced the father with a group of friends. Swapped adult grief for adolescent discovery. But he kept the tone, the pace, the ache. One executive, speaking off the record, said, "Echoes was like a heartbeat. Reiner just changed the face attached to it." So why didn't Spielberg sue? Because of one crucial detail. He never registered the first draft with the WGA. That's right. Spielberg, in a rare lapse, never formally protected Echoes. He'd registered later drafts. Notes. Summaries. But not the original. And Reiner? He used that gap. By pitching the premise as inspired by King, he shielded himself. Legally? Untouchable. Morally? That's another story. Nick Reiner's discovery in 2025 blew everything wide open. Because in the version Nick found, the SS/original, "Do not use copy." There was something else. A note scrawled in the margin of page 17. Reiner's handwriting. 3 words. "Use this later." What was the scene? A boy, alone in a junkyard, crying while holding an old baseball glove. Talking to no one. Reaching out to memory. Trying to make sense of loss. That scene ended up, beat for beat, in Stand By Me. Rewritten, reframed, but undeniably the same. Spielberg saw that. And he broke. He reportedly told his lawyer, "I want it back. I don't want credit. I just want it back." But it was too late. Reiner was dead. Nick was in custody. And the past had resurfaced, blood-stained and bitter. So now we ask the question, when does a story stop being yours? When someone else tells it better? When you fail to protect it? Or when you hand it over in trust and never get it back? Spielberg trusted Reiner, shared something personal, and watched it morph into someone else's masterpiece. But what haunted him most wasn't the theft. It was what came after, because buried in Reiner's safe, underneath the draft of echoes, was a cassette tape, labeled simply, 1998, Dinner, Do Not Play. And what was on that tape? Well, that would be the beginning of the end. If you saw someone commit a crime, but everyone around you said, "Don't say a word," would you still speak up? Now imagine that person is powerful, beloved, protected. Would you still tell the truth? Or would you stay silent until silence became a prison of its own? In Hollywood, silence isn't weakness. It's currency. It's survival. And for decades, Steven Spielberg paid the price of keeping his mouth shut. He didn't stay quiet because he was afraid. He stayed quiet because that's what Hollywood expected. But silence doesn't erase betrayal. It just delays the reckoning. 1998, a dinner no one talks about. Not officially. No public photos. No quotes in Variety. No IMDb trivia page. But behind closed doors, it was legendary. A gathering of titans: Spielberg, Reiner, Tom Hanks, Nora Ephron, Robert Zemeckis. At a vineyard in Santa Barbara. A private estate. Candlelight. Red wine. Too many forks at the table. It was supposed to be celebratory. A new Hollywood reunion of friends and collaborators. But it turned into something else entirely. Because after the fourth course, Spielberg stood up, raised a glass, and said casually, "Here's to all the stories we didn't tell and the ones that got stolen." The table went quiet. Reiner laughed, a little too loud. Zemeckis coughed. Ephron raised an eyebrow. Hanks sipped his wine. Spielberg smiled. And then he sat down. What happened after that was captured on a hidden recorder. A small device left running by Reiner's assistant, who was seated in the next room. The tape, unearthed years later, was labeled 1998, Dinner, Do Not Play. But Nick Reiner did play it. And what he heard changed everything. Let's listen to a fragment. Spielberg: "You know what's funny, Rob? I was watching Stand By Me the other day. With my daughter. She loved it." Reiner: "Still holds up." Spielberg: "It does. It really does. Even the scene with the glove." Pause. Reiner: "Which glove?" Spielberg: "You know which one." Long silence. Reiner: "Steve, come on. It's been 15 years. Spielberg: "Exactly. 15 years and not a word. Not even a thank you. That was the heart of it. Not credit. Not money. Acknowledgement." Spielberg never wanted a lawsuit. He wanted the truth. And he never got it. Until that tape resurfaced, in 2025, in the Brentwood guest house. Why didn't Spielberg go public back then? Because of what happened next. Reiner's team, according to leaked memos, threatened legal containment if any accusations were made public. They claimed Spielberg had no actionable evidence, and that any statements would be considered defamatory and retaliatory. And then came the studio pressure. A high-level executive from Universal allegedly warned Spielberg, "If you go after Rob, people will say you're jealous, that you're trying to rewrite history. Don't do this. Not now." Spielberg was stunned. He was Spielberg, the most bankable director of the era. But even he couldn't shake the code of silence. Hollywood protects its own, as long as you don't rock the boat. And if you do, you find yourself exiled. Slowly, quietly, permanently. So Spielberg folded. He let it go, on the surface. But privately, he started documenting everything. He transcribed every call. He saved every voicemail. He recorded entries in a leather-bound journal, later referred to in court as the Echoes Log. Over the next 2 decades, Spielberg would fill 3 volumes of notes. Every interaction with Reiner, every quote, every near confession. He was building a case, not for the courts, but for the truth. Because he knew someday someone would need it. That someone would be Rob Reiner's son. Nick Reiner grew up in silence, too. But not the protective kind. The suffocating kind. He was told what to say, how to act, what to wear. He watched his father speak on political panels, give TED Talks, win Lifetime Achievement Awards. But at home, Nick saw a different man. bitter, defensive, prone to rage. Nick once told a friend, "My dad lives in applause. When it's quiet, he breaks." And the one topic that always set Rob off? Spielberg. Nick remembered the name Echoes. He remembered finding the script. He remembered asking his dad why it said SS on the cover. Reiner's reply? That was a placeholder. It didn't mean anything. But Nick knew. He always knew. In 2012, Nick confronted his father. Fresh out of rehab. Tired. Angry. He held up the script in front of him. "Did you take this?" Reiner snapped. "It was an idea. Ideas aren't property. I turned it into something better." Nick didn't speak. He just stared. Then he whispered, "You stole it. And you know it." From that moment, Nick began to unravel. He tried writing screenplays. Most of them were rejected. Producers said they were too dark, too angry, too personal. One script, titled Reflections, was described as a veiled confession disguised as fiction. Plot: a son discovers his famous father plagiarized a dead friend's novel and decides to destroy the legacy built on lies. Sound familiar? It was rejected by every studio. Except one, a small indie company who later dropped the project after pressure from unnamed advisors. Nick knew he was being watched, controlled, silenced, just like Spielberg had been. So he started gathering evidence. From his father's office, from old hard drives, from cassettes hidden in dusty cabinets. He burned them onto USBs, labeled each one, kept them in a lockbox under his bed. And one day, he mailed one of them to Spielberg. No return address, just a note. "You were right. I'm sorry it took so long." Inside the envelope, the 1998 dinner tape. Spielberg cried when he heard it. Not because of the betrayal, but because someone finally acknowledged it. He didn't go public. Not yet. But that's when his tone shifted. He stopped using Rob's name in interviews. Stopped mentioning Stand By Me. Started preparing for something. Because silence only lasts so long before it starts to echo back. And in late 2025, the echo became a roar. The Hollywood code of silence began to crack. A former Castle Rock assistant went on the record. A journalist uncovered metadata from the original Echoes draft. A tech at a recording studio admitted to cleaning up a cassette for Reiner's lawyer back in '98. The pieces were coming together. And just before the new year, Spielberg made a private call to a producer at Netflix. "I want to tell a story," he said. "But not mine. His." They scheduled a meeting for January 3rd. That meeting never happened. Because on January 2nd, Rob and Michelle Reiner were found dead. Stabbed. Slumped over their coffee table. And at their feet, a script. Echoes. Covered in blood. So now the silence is gone. And what's left? Just a question. What else has been buried in this town? Under charm, charisma, and camera flashes. Because if Rob Reiner could steal a story from Steven Spielberg and get away with it for 40 years, who else is hiding behind a curtain of applause? But that curtain? It's about to be ripped down. Because next, we open the door to the one person who knew everything. Nick Reiner. And what he found would make even Spielberg gasp. If you were raised in the shadows of a legend, what would you do to step into the light? What if the man everyone praised was the one who betrayed the only person who ever inspired you? And what if your entire life, every failure, every breakdown, every dark spiral, could be traced back to one stolen story? This isn't just about Nick Reiner becoming the prime suspect in a brutal double homicide. It's about a son trying to bury a lie by exposing the truth his father took to the grave. Let's meet Nick Reiner. Not the criminal, not the addict, not the headline. Let's meet the boy who grew up alone in the middle of a crowd. Born in 1993, Nick was Hollywood royalty from the moment he opened his eyes. His father was Rob Reiner, Emmy-winning actor, director of When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men, and Stand By Me. His grandfather was Carl Reiner, one of the most influential comedy legends of all time. Nick's cradle was surrounded by Oscars, Emmys, scripts, and power meetings. He had everything, except identity. From an early age, Nick struggled to connect with his father. Rob was distant, not cruel, not abusive, just emotionally unavailable. He was always in a meeting, always prepping for a pitch, always flying to another set. Nick once said in a therapy session, he'd listen to a stranger's monologue on set for hours, but I couldn't get 5 minutes at dinner. The only time they truly bonded? Watching films together. And guess who Nick gravitated toward? Steven Spielberg. Nick adored Spielberg's work. At 5, he was obsessed with E.T. At 8, he cried watching Empire of the Sun. At 12, he begged his dad to let him visit the set of Minority Report. But Rob? He hated talking about Spielberg. Shrugged off his son's enthusiasm. If Nick quoted Schindler's List, Rob would change the subject. And one night, when Nick asked why they didn't invite Spielberg to his bar mitzvah, Rob simply said, "That bridge burned a long time ago." No explanation. No elaboration. Just silence. The silence infected Nick. By the time he was 15, he was experimenting with pills. By 16, he'd overdosed in a hotel room during an industry party. By 17, he was in rehab. His father? Still distant. One therapist reported. Nick viewed his father as a phantom, someone he was supposed to know, but never could. And beneath that emotional chasm, something else was brewing. Resentment. Not just over abandonment, but over the story. It started with a script. During a holiday break in 2011, Nick was home, sober, fragile, curious. He wandered into his father's study, opened an old filing cabinet, and there it was. A script titled Echoes. Typed. Faded. Yellowing at the edges. Author, Steven Spielberg. Handwritten notes in red ink. Scene 3, remove diner. Add junkyard. Nick recognized the handwriting. It was his father's. He froze. He read the first 10 pages, then 20, then all of it. And when he finished, he felt like he'd been hit by a truck. Because the story was him. He confronted Rob that night. "You took this from Spielberg?" Rob didn't deny it. Didn't confirm it either. He just said he didn't want it. It wasn't right for him. "I made it work." Nick shouted. "That's not the same thing." But Rob raised a hand, eyes cold. "You don't understand how Hollywood works. Stories evolve. Everyone borrows. That's the business." But Nick did understand. He understood that this lie, this theft, was the foundation of his father's empire. And it cracked something inside him. From that moment, Nick changed. He became obsessed. He hunted for evidence. Reread every interview his father had ever given. Watched Spielberg panels, looking for coded references. Even tried emailing Spielberg once. The message bounced. He started writing his own scripts. Raw, emotional, angry. One of them, The House on Hollow Hill, was about a boy who discovers his father is a fraud. He submitted it under a pseudonym. It was optioned briefly by an indie producer, until the Reiner name was attached. Then, dropped. Coincidence? Nick didn't think so. He spiraled again. More drugs. More rehab. Then isolation. By 2023, he was living in the guest house behind his parents' Brentwood mansion. Rarely came to family dinners. Didn't attend premieres. Didn't respond to texts. Neighbors said they often saw him walking circles around the backyard at 3 a.m., whispering to himself, clutching notebooks. He wasn't writing. He was remembering. He was building a case. And here's where things turned dark. In late 2025, Nick found a hidden compartment in his father's safe. Inside, the original Echoes draft. A letter from Spielberg, dated 1984. Excited to explore this more with you. Notes from Castle Rock story meetings, referencing SS script. And a cassette tape labeled 1998, Dinner, Do Not Play. Nick played the tape. We already know what he heard. What we don't know is what it did to him. In the days following that discovery, Nick deleted his social media, made multiple large cash withdrawals, purchased a burner phone, called Spielberg's production office twice, mailed an anonymous package to Amblin Entertainment, and on December 28th, he sent an email to his therapist that read, "I have to set this right. I have to end it before it spreads." New Year's Eve, Rob and Michelle Reiner hosted a quiet gathering. Close friends. No media. No fanfare. Nick didn't attend the dinner. He stayed in the guest house. But security footage shows him entering the main house at 1:23 a.m. By 2:11 a.m., both his parents were dead. Nick was found outside, blood on his hands, sitting on the steps, crying. Beside him, the Echoes script. Why did he do it? No one knows for sure, but prosecutors claim motive. Rage, delusion, years of resentment. His defenders say this was the result of generational rot, of growing up in a house built on deception, of watching a father lie to the world while neglecting the one person who needed him most. Nick told police, "He stole something sacred, and he told me I should be proud." And what about Spielberg? He made no statement for 2 weeks. Then, when asked by a journalist at a charity event, he simply said, "I despise him. He stole from me, lied about it, and paid the price." A brutal sentence. But was it justice? Was Nick's act an unhinged attack, or a final, desperate attempt at truth? Here's what we know for sure. Nick didn't just want his father gone. He wanted the story returned to its rightful owner. He believed that by destroying the lie, he could heal the wound. But healing? That was never on the table. Because in Hollywood, wounds aren't meant to be healed. They're meant to be packaged. And just as the world mourned Rob Reiner, something surfaced. A sealed envelope, labeled, "To Steven, if anything happens to me." What was inside? You'll want to sit down for this. What happens when the truth tries to come out, but the entire room pretends not to hear it? What if the dinner table, that symbol of family unity, becomes a battleground for buried secrets, old wounds, and simmering rage? What if the person you're breaking bread with is the one who broke you? Nick Reiner wasn't just angry. He wasn't just bitter. He was a bomb waiting to go off. And the spark came at a dinner meant to heal, but ended up doing the exact opposite. December 24th, 2025. Christmas Eve, Brentwood, California. The Reiner estate was decorated in flawless white lights. The $13.5 million mansion glittered like a Hallmark movie. Michelle Reiner had organized everything. Roast duck, a classical quartet playing softly by the fireplace, personalized name cards, the works. She wanted peace. She wanted the family whole again, even if it was just for one night. Nick had been invited. Not demanded, not begged, invited. And to everyone's shock, he showed up, clean-shaven, sober, wearing a navy blue blazer. He even brought a bottle of wine. Michelle nearly cried. Rob stiffened. The atmosphere? Electric, and not in a good way. The Reiner family hadn't been in the same room together for months. Nick had been a ghost. Rob had been busy with a documentary project. Michelle had been trying, desperately, to be the bridge between them. But that night, everything was fragile. Every word felt rehearsed. Every smile was tight. Every silence felt loud. And then came the moment. The moment that cracked it all open. The moment Nick pulled out a script. It wasn't subtle. He reached into his leather satchel, pulled out the original Echoes draft, placed it on the table, right between the mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce. Dead silence. Michelle blinked. Rob looked like he'd seen a ghost. Nick? He leaned back. Calm. Cold. Waiting. Finally, Rob spoke. "What is this?" "Nick, you know what it is." Rob, trying to keep control. "Not now? Not here." Nick didn't flinch. "Why not? Because we have company? Or because Mom doesn't know what you did?" Michelle turned pale. She looked between them, back and forth, tried to smile, tried to say something to soften it. But Nick wasn't done. He picked up the script, flipped to page 22. Read aloud. The boy places his hand on the watch, eyes rolling back, whispers. She left him, but she was never gone. Then he looked directly at Rob. That line, word for word. Your movie, your hit. Rob snapped. "I made that line better." The room froze. Nick laughed. Just once. Then leaned forward, eyes burning. "No, you just said it louder. And people listened because you wore the right suit." What happened next was chaos. Rob slammed his fist on the table. "You don't know what it's like to carry a career on your back. You don't know how this industry works." Nick fired back. "I know it rewards liars. I know it props up thieves." Michelle tried to intervene. "Please, both of you. Not like this. It's Christmas." Nick looked at her, softened, almost broke. But then Rob said one word too many. "You're just like him." Nick blinked. "Like who?" "Rob. Spielberg. Petty. Fragile. Obsessed with being the victim." And that was it. Nick stood up so fast his chair slammed backward. He pointed at his father. "You didn't just steal his story. You killed mine. You made me grow up in a lie. And now you want me to pretend it never happened." The housekeeper, hearing the shouting, entered. Michelle ushered her out quickly. She knew this needed to stay private. Rob, seething, said, "You're a disappointment. Always have been." Nick turned to Michelle. "Is that true?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Nick nodded, picked up the script, held it to his chest. "I'm keeping this." "Rob, that's mine." "Nick, no, it never was." He walked out. Not another word. Not another glance. Just silence, the kind that sticks to the walls for days. Later that night, Michelle found a note slipped under her bedroom door. It was from Nick. "Mom, I know you were trying. I'm sorry, but this ends now. One way or another. I'm done pretending." She cried reading it. She didn't show Rob. She hid the note in a drawer, next to old birthday cards, next to happier memories, the kind that were fading fast. The next 5 days were a ticking time bomb. Rob didn't speak to Nick. Michelle tried. Nick ignored her calls. Then, on New Year's Eve, another dinner. Smaller. Just Rob and Michelle. Nick didn't come. Until he did. At 1:23 a.m., security footage captured him entering through the back gate, wearing gloves, carrying something under his arm. A kitchen light turned on at 1:41. By 2:11 a.m., everything was over. The police report described the scene as chaotic, personal, and emotionally explosive. No signs of forced entry. No robbery. Just 2 bodies. And a script. The same one from Christmas Eve. Stained. Torn. Covered in fingerprints. At the bottom of the final page, in Nick's handwriting. It ends where it started. With the truth. The investigation would uncover everything. The secret files. The letters. The tapes. The envelope marked for Steven. But it all began at that dinner table. With mashed potatoes, wine, and a screenplay that had haunted an entire family for decades. A story buried. Resurrected. Then weaponized. And as the bodies were taken away, Spielberg's phone rang. The LAPD wanted to know, "Did you write something called Echoes?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared out the window and whispered. It was supposed to stay buried. But now the world would hear it all. Because up next, a leather journal. Spielberg's own words. And one name written in capital letters. Nick, what do you write when you can't say it out loud? When the world applauds your work, but you're drowning in betrayal. When the person who stole from you smiles across dinner tables, shares panels, and builds an empire on your silence. You write it down. And that's exactly what Steven Spielberg did for over 30 years. He didn't scream. He didn't sue. He documented. In a series of leather-bound journals known only to a few people in his inner circle, Spielberg kept a record of everything. And when investigators opened those pages for the first time, they weren't just reading a diary. They were unearthing a time bomb. The journals were found in Spielberg's private office vault, 3 volumes, thick and weathered, marked SS/personal, confidential. Only 5 people had ever seen them. Only 2 had read them in full. And after the murder of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the LAPD requested access. At first, Spielberg hesitated. But then he handed them over. Without a lawyer. Without conditions. He just said, "You'll find the truth in there. Whether or not anyone listens. That's up to you." Let's open Volume 1. The first entry is dated August 12, 1983. Today I told Rob about the boy. The visions. The road trip. He listened. Asked good questions. Said it felt too heavy for him. I appreciated the honesty. There's a scribble in the margin. "Don't forget, dinner in Big Bear next week. Bring printed draft." That dinner would become infamous. Because just 2 weeks later, Spielberg logged this. I showed Rob the full outline. He seemed excited. Maybe too excited. Kept asking if I'd registered it yet. I said not yet. He said, "I wouldn't wait if I were you." Strange tone. Joking? Maybe. That joke would haunt Spielberg for decades. Volume I continues, building in tension. Entry after entry, he chronicles his growing suspicion. September 19, 1983. He asked again about the boy's ability. Wanted to know if I saw it as metaphor or literal. Said he was inspired to explore something similar. I laughed. Now I wonder if I should have said no. October 11, 1983. Castle Rock just optioned a new story for Rob. No details yet, but I have a bad feeling. Echoes hasn't left my mind, and I haven't touched it since. And then, on January 3, 1985, Stand By Me. That's the name of the project. Based on Stephen King, they say. But I read the body. This is something else. This is Echoes, stripped of the supernatural and injected with nostalgia. But here's where the journal shifts. Spielberg doesn't spiral into rage. He becomes clinical, measured. He begins to catalog similarities between Echoes and Stand By Me. Page 22 of Echoes. Boy cries alone near a junkyard. Scene 17 of Stand By Me. Same setting. Same emotional beat. Echoes. Father figures absent, but longed for. Stand By Me. Gordy's grief, Chris's broken home. Echoes, monologue about remembering things that never happened, but feeling them anyway. Stand by me. I never had any friends later on like the ones I had when I was 12. Entry dated March 8, 1986. He didn't take the scenes. He took the soul. That's what hurts the most. But Spielberg doesn't just write about the script. He writes about Nick. First mention, July 21st, 1995. Saw Nick today. He was 2. Blonde curls. Asked me to show him my camera. Rob looked uncomfortable. Strange moment. Then, August 12th, 1998. Nick was at the Santa Barbara dinner. Didn't say much. Hid behind his mom. But when Rob made that joke about Echoes being a collaboration, Nick looked at me. He knew something was off. He's smart. Sensitive. And finally, on November 2nd, 2004, got an email. Anonymous. Said, he took more than your story. He took your voice. I'll find a way to give it back. Signed N.R. Spielberg circled the initials. Wrote one word beneath them. Nick. Volume 2 becomes darker. There are entries about sleepless nights. About Rob's rising fame. About watching The Princess Bride, A Few Good Men, The American President, and feeling echoes of echoes everywhere. He used my rhythms. My tone. My silences. He became the man I might have been if I'd let go of my integrity. And one particularly haunting entry. June 16, 2006. I watched Stand By Me again. This time with headphones. The sound of the train. The silence after the gunshot. The look on Gordy's face in the junkyard. That was me. That was my childhood. He didn't just steal a story. He stole me. But Spielberg never acted. Not publicly. Instead, he continued to journal. To document. To remember. Volume 3, the final journal, spans from 2012 to 2025. And in it, Spielberg begins preparing for something. He writes less like a man journaling, and more like a man building a record. If anything happens, if this explodes, if Nick does what I fear he might, let this be the map, the context, the proof. One entry from October 18th, 2024 is chilling. Nick called me. He was calm. Too calm. Said he had the script. Said he found the tape. Said he knew what needed to be done. I told him, don't do anything stupid. He said, it's already been done. That call was never recorded. But it's logged, dated, cross-referenced. And then, the final entry, dated December 30th, 2025. Received a package. No name. Just a note. This belongs to you. Inside my script. My notes. My voice. Covered in someone else's edits. Blood on the edge of the paper. I cried. For the first time in years. He ends with, this isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. About giving the story back to the one who lived it. I just wish it didn't take death to do it. Why did Spielberg keep these journals? Because words were all he had. He couldn't go public. Couldn't sue. Wouldn't destroy his own reputation to avenge a stolen script. So he wrote. Quietly. Furiously. Faithfully. For 3 decades. And in those pages, he immortalized not just the theft, but the thief. And perhaps, the redemption. Because in one of the final entries, Spielberg writes, Nick isn't just his father's son. He's mine too, in the way we feel things too deeply. In the way we can't forget. And then, in large bold letters, he'll give it back, even if it kills him. Investigators have since confirmed the journal's authenticity. Handwriting matches. Ink analysis checks out. Dates align with known events. They are real. They are raw. And they are damning. So now we know. Spielberg wasn't silent. He was strategic. And while the world was watching Rob Reiner climb, Spielberg was watching from the shadows. Documenting. Waiting. And finally, witnessing the return of what was his. But it's not over. Because inside that sealed envelope marked, for Steven, was something no one expected. A confession? A plea? A trap? Have you ever created something from your soul, and then watched someone else take credit for it? Imagine the feeling. You're sitting in a darkened theater. The audience laughs. They cry. They clap. They call it a masterpiece. And deep inside, you know every beat, every line, every tear, because you wrote it. But your name isn't in the credits. That's the agony Steven Spielberg lived with for over 30 years. And it all comes back to one missing draft. The blueprint for a story that would never carry his name, but shaped a Hollywood legacy built on lies. Let's rewind to 1983. Spielberg was in creative overdrive. He was juggling Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, setting the stage for The Color Purple, and trying to decide whether to helm a sci-fi thriller called Starman. He passed. It went to John Carpenter. But there was one project he was personally attached to. A quiet, slow-burn drama. No aliens. No action. Just a boy, a father, and a strange gift. The script was called Echoes. It was never meant to be a blockbuster. It was meant to be honest. The plot. Simple. A recently widowed father, emotionally distant and grieving, takes his 11-year-old son on a spontaneous road trip after the boy is expelled from school for disturbing behavior. The reason for the expulsion? The boy claims he can hear things when he touches old objects, snippets of conversations, flashes of memories, long-dead voices. The father doesn't believe him, thinks it's trauma, grief. But as they drive cross-country, encountering strangers, antiques, motels, haunted diners, the visions intensify. In one town, the boy touches a war medal and describes the death of a soldier in vivid detail. The father is shaken. By the third act, the father begins to believe. But what he doesn't know? The boy's visions are leading somewhere, to his mother's past, to a secret she never told, and the father's darkest fear. That she didn't die, she ran. Spielberg never intended to release Echoes in the mid-80s. The industry wasn't ready. Studios wanted popcorn hits, not spiritual dramas.